That's official.
Got it.
Welcome, everyone, to it's kind of a combo. Think again, faith again. Sometimes it leans secular, sometimes it leans religious. Tonight's really leaning both ways, I think, because we're covering a topic, an initiative that's trying to reach just everybody in the world, basically. Pretty much. So it includes all religions and ideologies, humanists, and everybody, because we believe it can make a big difference, not just for the planet, but for everybody who lives on it, which there's a sizable amount of humans right now. Hopefully, you've all looked at the website and read the bios of Bob, Rees, and Martin Palmer. The last few days, I've had a chance to be with Martin and Bob and Gloria, Bob's wife. And I've just been delighted to hear and their ideas and what they've been talking about in terms of this initiative, as well as just to get to know Martin. I know my dear friend Bob pretty well, but Martin I'd never met before and was not aware of. And so getting to know Martin Palmer has been just fabulous. And I hope all of you, again, if you haven't read his bio, will read, because it's impressive. Right? I might have him just take a moment and quickly explain the work that he's been doing after Bob, or maybe Bob will introduce him. But it's pretty impressive. Many of you know Bob already and his beautiful resume of the work he's done for the Benefit Children's Foundation to help hungry, particularly LDS children and their friends. But also the environmental things he's done, things for the LGBTQ community, for the kids. You know, Bob's just always a delight to be with and have. So I don't want to take too much time doing other things beyond what we've come here tonight to do. So I am, right after one announcement, I'm going to have Bob and Martin again. But Zach from Faith Matters, who I'm on the advisory board, has come, which I'm delighted. I didn't know he's going to come. But he and Faith Matters have put together a really exciting in-person conference in October at the store. And I'm just going to let him briefly introduce that, because that's going to be really valuable and important. And Zach, tell him what your role is as on Faith Matters.
Great. Camera there.
Yeah. You still a little bit closer to Bob. There you go. Nice to meet you. Tell me a little bit about you.
So I'm the new executive director of Faith Matters, which is a beautiful organization helping to cultivate a more expansive Latter-day Saint tradition. And one of the things that we have been wanting to do for a while is to gather in person with our listeners and people who have followed our work. So on October 7th and 8th, in Salt Lake City, we're hosting our first public conference, gathering, festival, party called Restore. And it will be full of conversations and talks and music by people like Carol and Fiona, Patrick Mason, Jennifer Finlayson-Fife, and many other people who've been on the Faith Matters podcast and part of our community.
You got Carolyn Pearson.
Carolyn Pearson will be there. Mallie Bonner. Mallie's family choir, the Unity Gospel Choir, will be performing. We'll have art, we'll have spoken word, and most importantly, we'll be able to come together as a community of people trying to live a radiant Mormonism. And I think it'll be a lot of fun. You can learn more by going to faithmatters.org/restore.
Thank you. Now you still do some podcasts on your own with, is it Harvard Divinity School?
That's right. Yeah. I got into media, making online courses, and then I started making a podcast about 6 years ago called The Ministry of Ideas. And that is a show about the modern world, about culture, philosophy, history, religion. And it's hosted at Harvard Divinity School. And it's been a real joy to work on. And my favorite thing about the show is that my liberal friends think it's for them and my conservative friends think it's for them.
Win-win.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Zach. All right, time is now yours and Martin's.
Well, it's just a pleasure to see all of you and to be part of this community here. Just have been so much in admiration of the work that Jay and others have done to bring this community together in faith and in love for a purpose that I believe we all share, which is exemplified what Zach talked about, radiance. There's something I have started 3 years ago when I started a session at Sunstone called Radiant Womanism, which I try to honor people who really exemplify that idea. It comes out, of course, out of the gospel of Christ, who is the radiant being in the universe. But as we, as Latter-day Saints, believe that we have the light of Christ in us and that all of God's creatures do, that radiance is something that it seems to me naturally comes from our trying to create this kind of community. So the radiant ideas that Zach has been working on, it just is such an excitement to be working with ideas that that reflect that light, that reflect that love. I've been reading a book, it's a novel, it's called Unify. It's a kind of a climate fiction book by Kim Robinson called The Ministry of the Future. It's a fascinating book about what we may be facing as human beings in the near future as well as in the far future. And I've been reading that book, I've been thinking about what the word ministry really means. And I used it in a sense that in Latter-day Saint terms, 3 or 4 years ago, we changed from something called home teaching, which essentially was how we take care of one another within our congregations. And President Nelson and the leader of the church decided to change the focus from home teaching to ministry. And we now speak of ministering brothers and sisters in our congregations. Ones who look out for one another, who care for one another, who pray and walk with one another. And that idea of ministry is something that inspires me and inspired Gloria and me to begin thinking about what could we do for this precious planet spinning in space, which is the jewel of the universe from our perspective. And so we have been thinking about things that we can do personally within our relationship, within our home, within our community. We are on a committee, an interfaith committee in Marin County called ADAPT, which is looking at whatever happens in the future. One of the things that will be happening to all of us that we're going to have to adapt to whatever is coming. But as we began thinking about that and thinking about it in relation to the gospel and to the church, the thought came to us that one of the things we would like to do is in our small way and perhaps in other ways is to help unify the faiths of the world in terms of this stewardship we have over the creatures, the plants, the planet itself. And so the idea came to us that one of the things we do each month is to fast on the first Sunday of the month. And during that 24 hours, focus our attention on other people, on people who have much less than we do. We travel in our work with the Bountiful Children's Foundation. And so we are able to see children who do not have enough to sustain them, whose bodies and brains are being stunted and wasted because they don't have even basic food. And so in the fasts that we have, and Latter-day Saints traditionally begin their fast with a prayer and end their fast with a prayer of thanksgiving. The thought occurred to us if we could share this idea of fasting with all of the people in the world who believe in some power beyond themselves, as well as some power within themselves, it would be a lovely thing to begin sharing that idea. And so as we talked about this, I shared the idea with Sally Bingham, who is a minister, a reverend in the Anglican Episcopal Church, and who she's one of the founders, at least, of the how do we call it, environmental light and power. Is that right?
Power and light.
Interfaith Power and Light.
Yes, interfaith power and light. Thank you, Mark. And Sally has become a good friend. And when I shared this idea with her, she said the person you need to do is Martin Palmer. And so I sent a few ideas to Martin, and he came back with more ideas and more wonderful energy and inspiration that we combined into this idea that perhaps we could persuade the people of all faiths to fast for the future of this planet. And so Martin came up with the name, and we began talking about how we could do it. And Martin has probably the most impressive resume of anyone I know in terms of bringing faiths together to work for the planet. I'll have him tell you about that more than I would pretend to. But as this idea has evolved, as we talk to people about it, it's begun to have an energy and a life, and I would say a sense of ministry. Almost every religion believes in and practices fasting for all kinds of reasons, but with the Muslims in Ramadan, with the Catholics and others in Lent, with the Jews in Yom Kippur, with the Latter-day Saints, so many people believe in and practice fasting. I believe that God is a great dramaturg who arranges things that can catch our attention if we're paying attention. And so like a great Shakespearean dramaturg, he's arranging things. And so the coincidence that in the past 10 or 20 years, medical science has begun to talk about the importance of fasting. Just recently, a study done, maybe even someone said in Utah, I'm not sure where, that fasting reduces the effects of COVID. But what we have are people doing intermittent fasting and special fasting and long fasting. But fasting has become very popular, even for people who may not consider themselves believers or people of faith. So that coincidence is, to me, is a miracle waiting for us to take advantage of. And so this is an idea that we've just begun sharing, and Martin can tell you about the people in his orbit who've already begun associating or said, we want to be part of this. Lori and I were at the Episcopal Diocese today at St. Mark's, and the people there said, this is such a wonderful idea. We want to be part of it. How can we join with you in what we're doing in terms of our creation, stewardship, or care of the earth? So we're excited about this idea. We're so happy to share it. We shared it with a group of people on Saturday. Some of you were there, and wonderful response to that. So this is an opportunity to share this, what I am beginning to think more increasingly of as a ministry. And so I really want the time to be shared abundantly with my dear friend, colleague and brother in this work, Martin Palmer. So I'm happy to turn the time over to you, Martin, and we'll have an opportunity to have some questions. The time is yours.
Well, thank you, Bob, and thank you, Jay, for this opportunity. And I'm really sorry not to be with you. It sounds rather like good fun, frankly, but I'm in Edmonton in Canada visiting my very old, very frail godfather who I have not seen for a long time. And just delighted that the miracles of modern technology, of which I have absolutely no understanding whatsoever, make it possible for us to be in touch like this. I'm very grateful that my godfather's son knows what he's doing with equipment. So, and it has been it was an amazing time in Salt Lake City with Bob and Gloria in particular, but with so many wonderful, fascinating people. Learning much more from my side. I'm an Anglican, Episcopalian, as you call it, and I've spent my entire working life working with major faiths, not to unite them. I don't have the slightest interest in what unites faiths, because that's not why we belong to faiths. We belong to our traditions because we believe they hold something true, something precious, something beautiful, something wonderful, a gift that we can share with the world. So my work has been celebrating the sheer diversity of faith, and then saying to the people in faith, what are you doing because of what you believe? Come and share it with others who don't share your beliefs, but will share delight in the fact that you're doing things. And just a very brief resume, I suppose. As I say, I'm an Anglican. I studied theology at Cambridge. It's the real one, not the faux one on the East Coast, the real one in England. And I also studied classical Chinese because before I went to university, my parents and I mutually agreed that about 6,000 miles between us would be a very, very good idea. So I went and worked for a year at a children's home in Hong Kong, which is where I learnt to appreciate Chinese culture, but also to read classical Chinese. And in my spare time, which isn't as much as I would like, I translate classical Chinese. So if any of you know the great classics like the Tao Te Ching, the I Ching, and other such great texts of China, I've translated most of those for publication. But my main work really has been as a result of a book that I wrote in 1982, which was the first ever book that was published for schools in Britain. In Britain, we have religious education. We think that you should actually know something about other faiths as well as your own, or if you don't have a faith, you should understand something about the great faiths that surround you. And so I was commissioned by the World Wildlife Fund, World WWF, to write a book for schools about how did different religions understand nature. And very interesting, Bob has used the word stewardship. Well, most of the world do not agree with the word stewardship. That's a very Abrahamic concept, a notion that somehow we've been put in charge. The majority of the world actually talks about relationship. Stewardship, I think, and you know, it's a phrase that I hear all the time, a very managerial one. I think actually our problem is that we've tried to manage the planet rather than be in relationship with it. And certainly the Taoists, the Shinto Buddhists, Jains, Hindus, Sikhs, who I've worked with, for them it's a nation, it's a sense of being a part of nature, not apart from it, managing it. And I think we, as in the Abrahamic traditions, have an enormous amount to learn about the danger of using managerial, technical language when we're talking about the gifts of God that surround us. So that's something that I think is terribly important. If we think everybody thinks about stewardship, they won't understand what you're talking about. Likewise, if they think that everybody understands we're all part of the cycle of life, many Christians, Muslims, and Jews won't understand what they're talking about. So our goal has always been to say, okay, given what you believe, what are you doing about it? And the very first meeting ever between the major faiths and the major environmental groups took place in Assisi in 1986. And I was asked to design and organize that by His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, the Queen's husband, who died last year at 99, just before his 100th birthday. I've been his religious advisor on the environment for 36 years. A great man, wonderful man, very funny, did not suffer fools gladly, and intellectually a towering giant because he read voraciously. And he was the person who said really to the environmental movement, you know, facts and figures and data, of course they're important. We need to know at an intellectual level what's happening. That's not why we'll change. We will change because something touches our hearts and minds, our hearts and our souls. And he said the only two things that have ever done that have been the arts and religion, and for much of history, they've been the same thing. And so he asked me, because of the work I'd already done on faiths and environment, to organize this first meeting in Assisi. At that point, there were 3 environmental projects by the faiths in the entire world. The Buddhist one in Thailand, a Christian one in Portugal, and the multi-faith program that we had developed for schools in the UK. That was it. 1985, 86, that was it. Now, the UN estimates there's 1.5 million religious projects on the environment around the world. And way back in 2009, when we had the big disastrous climate conference in Copenhagen, and the UN was looking around as to where is there hope, given the governments are not going to act to save the planet, and we know they're not. Where is the hope? And they said the major hope for the future of the planet lies with the faiths, because they are the largest civil society movement on the planet, in the world, anywhere, in any part of civil society. And I worked as religious advisor to WWF from 85 to 95. In 95, Prince Philip and I set up a specific organization to work with the faiths on environment. And by the time we finished and closed the organization in 2019, we had over 700 different religious traditions around the world that had made statements and commitments to protect the planet. And one of these big commitments is a thing that we call faith plans, because one of the issues is that the faiths are the 4th largest investing group in the world. They are the largest suppliers of education, larger than any government. We run 50% of all schools, 1/3 of all universities. We run more than 1/3 of all medical facilities. We own outright 8% of the habitable surface of the planet. We are stakeholders in the planet. So when we talk about the faiths and the environment, we have to remember that, yes, it's lovely that there are lots of projects now happening, but we're failing monumentally to be effective stakeholders of the planet, because we're not really mobilizing the resources we actually have to the degree that is necessary. And so we've developed projects from Mongolia to Mexico. We've helped faiths develop their own organic farms. We've helped them develop educational curriculums. We've helped them develop programs to protect waterways, et cetera, et cetera. We estimate that we've helped plant over 1,000, it's a billion trees in the last 15 years, from China across to North Africa. So it's very practical what we do. We've also managed to green the Hajj, for example, the Muslim pilgrimage. 25 years ago, there were 100 million plastic bottles left behind. It's very hot on the Hajj. We've managed to cut that down to 10 million last year through a process of making people, or helping people to take renewable water bottles and renewable bags, so they're not using plastic bags. So it's very practical stuff. And that's really why I was so fascinated when Bob got in touch with me about what we call Fast Forward. Because at the request of the UN, we relaunched a year ago this whole idea of faith long-term plans. Because one of the things that we discovered was that the faiths really didn't know what they owned or what they influenced. So part of what we do is we say to each faith, and we've got currently round about, well, in terms of actual congregations, communities, religious orders, and so forth, probably about 30,000 religious organizations, everything from sort of parishes and mosques through to the World Evangelical Alliance, for example, 600 million members, 1,900 universities around the world. We've said to them, great, you've made your commitments, you've made your statements that, to be a true child of God or of the gods, to be in true relationship with Krishna, to be following Muhammad, to be walking the eightfold path of Buddhism. This must involve care for the planet, care for the rest of creation here on this earth, the rest of evolution, whatever the story you need to tell to help you understand that we're part of something way bigger. But now what are you going to do? We are really facing some incredibly difficult times in terms of environment, in terms of biodiversity loss, in terms of agriculture, sustainable agriculture, in terms of just actually being able to pass on to our children and grandchildren a world that makes them stand in wonder and awe, like we did. So we said to them, what we now want you to do is to up the level of what you're doing. We have this thing called Faith Plans, and I was delighted on Saturday to meet people from the two Mormon environmental groups, some environmental management and others much more environmental beliefs and structures and thoughts and ideas. And to be able to say to them, well, why don't you join us? Why don't you join the over 30 different international and national religious environmental organizations, like Hazon, the largest Jewish environmental network, EcoSeek, the biggest Sikh one, Bhumi, which is the major Hindu one, and so forth. Why don't you join us and work with us, bringing in the specific insights that the Church of Latter-day Saints has. And I think here in particular, you, of all the Abrahamic inspired traditions, have a positive view of why we're here. The rewriting, the re-understanding, the reinterpretation of the fall as really the rise is, I think, an extraordinarily important insight for our contemporary world, because I watch with concern as the environmental movement slips into pseudo-religion. So it's very good at telling us that we're sinful, that we're wicked, that we're fallen, that we're evil, that we're bad. And if we would only sort of pay our annual subscription to WWF or Friends of the Earth, we could save the world and, you know, it'll all be fine. But that predicates upon fear. And fear is a very bad motivation for action, an incredibly bad motivation for faith. So I was delighted to discover, because I didn't know, that there were two Mormon environmental groups that were active, and so I'm very much hoping they will join us. But I think it goes beyond that. What Bob has come up with as an idea is, I think, going to be something of a contribution, a unique contribution from the Church of Latter-day Saints to the wider movement of the faiths around the world. In the faith plans, we have 7 areas that we ask each faith to think about. Some are more relevant to one faith than another. The first one is assets. How do you use your land? And I mean, the church has huge land holdings. How do you use your buildings? What use are they to local communities? How do they support people who are struggling? How do they support people who need to be encouraged? Then you have the assets itself. And as we now know, the church has about $100 billion invested. What are you doing with that? How faith consistent is that money? So it's marvelous that you raised money in order to be able to build temples. And I had the joy of being taken out to see the Saratoga Springs Temple, Bob, with the wonderful Ryan and his delightful wife, Kali, who we met, my wife and I met in a vegetarian restaurant in a back street in Crete about 3 months ago, and discovered that they were Mormons, and I was coming to see Salt Lake City. And so as the designer of, I think it's 6 temples, isn't it, Bob? And he's the man who's digging that ruddy great hole all the way around the temple in the center of Salt Lake City as well. So it was wonderful to meet with him and hear. But this question of assets, so it's marvelous. Yes, you're being able to fund new temples, you're able to maintain the enormous relief work that you do around the world. But if that money is being raised by investing, for example, in oil and petrochemicals or coal, which is destroying the planet, or if it's investing in gross consumerism, in appalling foods that produce heart attacks and ill health and are destructive to the planet, if you're not thinking about whether the products you're involved in are plastics, which need to be radically cut back, and something else in its place, then frankly, you're not being faith consistent. You're exploiting the planet to support you. and in no faith that I know, is that in any way a tenet that is supportable. So we had a very interesting discussion on Saturday. I hope that we will begin to sort of discuss how the Church of Latter-day Saints can be faith consistent. What will you invest in to make a better world? Not to lose money, it's not charity. This is about how do you earn the money from investing, but by doing so in a way that actually supports the better things that can happen for our planet: alternative transport, energy, sustainable agriculture, etc. These are not losses. You're not going to lose money by investing these. You could be the people who turn it around. At the moment, my organization, Faith Invest, which is there specifically to deal with assets, we've got about $500 billion worth of religious investments that has said it wants to move, drawn from many different faiths. And I would be delighted and excited if over the next few years we enter into some really interesting discussions with the church on this. But then the second area is youth and education, so schools, but also programs, for example, Torah Talmud classes within synagogues, Sunday schools, and so forth. But also, I doubt many of you know that around the world there are 6 youth organizations that have in them 400 million young people. And of those 6, 4 are almost always related to a faith, whether that's the Guides or the Girl Guides, the YMCA, YWCA. The outreach is huge, and we've not really thought about how we can use that. The third area is lifestyle. And this is where Bob's suggestion comes sailing through the door like a galleon. Because in lifestyles, this is about how do we each make a choice, a personal choice to live with integrity in our relationship with however you understand it to have been made and whatever relationship you should have with it, this unbelievably generous world that we are part of. And within that, the whole issue of sustainable food, or mindful food, mindful eating, as some of our partner groups call it, has become a really central focus. How do we, do we buy organic? Do we buy free range? Do we buy local? All those sort of issues. How do we support struggling farmers and so forth? But it was only Bob who came up with the idea of, well, how about building on the fact that most faiths, not all, most faiths have a tradition of fasting. And what if we were to make that not only mindful, so we were really thinking about how we live, not just that one day, but generally, but what if we released the money that could be released through that? And if we were to tie that in with major faiths around the world, Bob and I, in our wilder moments of ecstasy and delight, untampered by any hint of realism, would come up with figures like, well, we could be looking at, £100 million or dollars by the end of the first year, and that could be invested, that could be used to support environmental projects. So that's great. And the fourth area in the faith plans is wisdom. The faiths are the oldest surviving human structures in the world. We have outlived every empire, including the British, which was a little bit of a surprise to the English, frankly. We thought God was on our side, but I think he must have had an off day. No doubt he'll come back to his senses. But we outlived all the dynasties of China. We pretty much outlived communism. So we're going to be here in 1,000 years' time. The Conservative Party of the United Kingdom, and possibly even the Republicans of the United States, may not be in 1,000 years' time. And I know some of us are indeed praying that that will be the case. But they are transient. We are eternal. And you in the church have that premise stronger than any other group I know. I was struck when I discovered that your wedding vow is for eternity, not till death us do part. I think that captures such a fundamental concept of the fact that what we are part of is not transient. So wisdom, we have deep wisdom in there. The fifth area is that we have a huge outreach in terms of media. We run more television stations and radio stations and produce more daily newspapers and weekly newspapers than the whole of the European Union before we left it. The sixth area is partnerships. We don't need to invent what is a good diet. We don't need to invent what is a good transport system. We do not need to invent what is the best paper to use. There are hundreds of thousands of organizations out there to give us the skills, to give us the equipment and the resources that we need. And the UN, the World Bank, they all want to be partners with the faiths in making a better planet. And then the final thing, and I think this is also important about Fast Forward, is celebration. So often the faiths are very good at telling you what you cannot do. Celebration says, wow, well done, fantastic, let's have a party. Because if this isn't worth celebrating, if this amazing planet with these extraordinary people and fascinating faiths and traditions and insights and wisdom, if this isn't worth celebrating and therefore protecting, preserving, and enabling to continue, not just continue, but to perhaps be even better, then I really don't know why we bother. And I think Fast Forward, in the way that Bob always describes it, is not self-denial. It is self-purpose. And it is self-purpose for the bigger community of which we are part, and which we celebrate through being generous. And that's why I very much hope that we will be able to announce, and Bob and I are working furiously on this, we'll be able to announce before the next climate meeting in Egypt in November that we have a number of faiths that will join the Fast Forward process. The exciting thing being that we will always be acknowledging that this idea sprang not from the Catholic Church, not from the Muslims, sprang from the Church of Latter-day Saints. So I think I've said more than enough, and Bob is sitting on a very uncomfortable looking stool, and I don't want her to fall off, so I'm going to hand it back to Jay or to Bob or to all of you or whoever, and I'm really sorry not to be physically with you.
Let me just say a word. As a teacher of literature and the arts and religion, I'm very interested in imagery and symbolism. A couple of things from Martin's visit. The Saratoga Springs Temple is about 85% finished, and as Martin said, this coincidence, how we want to talk about he and his wife meeting the contractor on the Salt Lake Temple and these other temples in California, and a small restaurant in Creek resulted in Martin having this wonderful tour through Saratoga Springs Temple, beginning at the baptism on the backs of 12 oxen, going back to Solomon's Temple, coming up through the different rooms and the different processes of the endowment ceremony, and ending, and Brian had orchestrated this. We will end in the celestial room. The celestial room is essentially bare now, except for this beautifully sculpted carpet, chandeliers which throwing light everywhere, and beautifully painted walls of a beautiful color, and two very large mirrors on each side of where an altar is going to be. And so I had Martin come, and Gloria as well, and we looked into those mirrors and turned and looked the other way, and that connection between all of the people and the creatures who've ever lived on the earth to this point, where we stand at this point, and then looking forward into that other mirror with the echoing of those images of who we are as God's children, was for me a powerful metaphor for what I think we're all trying to do. Looking backward to take the wisdom of our ancestors who took care of this earth in beautiful and wise ways, looking forward into the future of those people our children, grandchildren, and others into the future, the far future, who will inherit this earth as it is now, or as we can begin to reclaim it with some sense of mission and ministry. That image sticks in my mind in a very powerful metaphor. So then we took Martin from that temple to the temple of the Alpine Loop. And Martin was astonished at the aspen groves that we drove through. And it took us a little bit of time, but I wanted to take him to Cascade Springs, because that's another metaphor for that bubbling of water flowing everywhere, just in such a magical way to listen to it and to see it flowing is a metaphor for, I think, what fast forward can do. Imagine that in a year or so, we begin Earth Day with a world fast. And throughout the world, there are people who are dedicated to fasting for the earth. And imagine a year after that, the celebration of what's happened. Martin's right, to be able to, we break our fast with a kind of celebration of eating and of praying. But think of the people of the world, Muslims and Sikhs and Zoroastrians and Jehovah's Witnesses and Catholics and everyone coming together in some way to celebrate a year in which we have fasted, and however that form that fast takes is not certain and is certainly not dictated or determined, but that perhaps each faith will determine how to do that. With the Latter-day Saints, it's a particular challenge because we're not interested in interrupting the fast system because it works so well. It's a beautiful thing. As a bishop, I loved being able to know that members of my congregation were fasting for other members of the congregation who were in need of some kind of care. However it happens that we make this small sacrifice, it is a small sacrifice. And I think God is asking us to make small sacrifices because if we ever have to make larger ones, we will be prepared because we know what it means to sacrifice on behalf of the elephants and the banyan trees and the rivers and the oceans and the creatures and our fellow human beings, whoever they are. So this idea of something very simple and now Mother Teresa, Lori and I love Mother Teresa's motto, we can do no great things, only small things with great love. And a fast is a simple thing, a small thing that we can do with great love. And one of the wonderful things that came out of this in discussions with Martin and our children and other people, someone said, well, you know, when the Catholics fast, they don't simply fast during Lent from food, but they give up things for that too. And fasting makes you think about how we can be more conservative in our use of water, and maybe we can, and our habits, maybe for that week or 2 weeks or whenever that month or that day in which we're fasting, we are thinking much more about the resources we use and our habits. And so this idea of doing something, doing it together, and uniting in a common cause, we think has a lot of potential. We're very interested in anyone's ideas about how to make this work, how to make it successful. And so the concept of unifying ourselves, not in terms of doctrine, not in terms of death, but all of us are unified in the sense that we have this immense gift from whatever we think of as the power beyond us that has sustained us. It has helped us to find beauty and meaning. I love teaching with the earth and the scriptures that do that. So I think everyone or almost everyone will find this an idea worth considering at least, and hopefully practicing. And so with Martin's vast experience of working with the faiths, with his enchantment of what Latter-day Saints can do, our understanding of who we are, our understanding of this, this enlightened idea to think that perhaps this great gift given to us. I imagine a time in the future when Christ comes that we give back to him the beauty of the earth. We give back to him a whole and healed planet. We give back to him gratitude that we've been able to use these beautiful gifts for others, for ourselves, for other creatures and other planet. So this is basically the idea. As Martin said, here's the beginning, but we're beginning to see its potential as other people. Martin already has been able to find people within his organization that reaches out to all the faiths, say, gee, this would be fun. I think we could have a good time. We can celebrate it. We can do this. And when Lori and I shared this today with the people over at St. Mark's, they said, wow, this is such a wonderful idea. We would love to be part of it. And their admiration for being in a community with the Latter-day Saints and other people who believe in the importance of people coming together to do this. So anyway, that's the idea. That's the concept. That's the inspiration and hopefully the imagination that can spark all of you to begin thinking about how you might do this, and you can do it on your own. Gloria and I this week said we could we could fast every week. One day we could fast for a couple of meals, and that would be good for us, and we could contribute that to a fund. So everyone can have ideas. I think that the great thing about I say in my teaching at the university, one of the greatest gifts of the Spirit, one of the greatest gifts that we have, and one of the greatest unused gifts of the Spirit is the imagination. So,
Hey, Bob,
yes,
let's use that imagination. Can we open it up now and get people
absolutely.
to share their thoughts about
Yes,
what they just
happy
heard?
to have anyone on the internet and anyone here.
Let's start back
ask
here.
Martin questions.
What a beautiful combination you two are. I love the team. Let me just build on your discussion of the temple. For those of us who have a connection to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and have been to the temple, the endowment session has a pretty significant chunk of time dedicated to the creation of the earth. And I think we need to remind our fellow Latter-day Saints about that again and again, that obviously the earth is important to God, and it should be important to us. And let's use the temple ceremony or endowment as evidence.
It's beautiful. Absolutely. I imagine, and this didn't come to me until just as you were talking about it, like I can imagine a time when on the prayer wheels of the church temples, we put elephants and tigers and birds and other creatures and as we form that prayer circle in the temple, we were praying not only for those who are ill or needy, but we're praying for other creatures as well. Who knows?
I'm sorry, I missed who just spoke. Can you just say your names, because I can't see everybody. So who was that?
Mark Coles Ritchie.
Mark
Well,
That
I think that's a beautiful notion. And I think what you've just touched on is something that I found in every single faith that I've worked with, which is that they have treasures of wisdom, insights, teachings that they've lost. They just haven't noticed them, or they've kind of taken them so much for granted that they've actually forgotten that they're there at all. And part of what happens when any faith tradition begins to engage seriously with the fact that the story of salvation, the story of redemption, liberation, freedom, whatever phraseology you want to do, self-understanding, it is always got to be taken beyond just human beings. We have become stealers of God's grace in the Christian tradition by making it only about us. Whereas St. Paul says this is about the fact that the whole of creation groans. So I think that sense of actually beginning to look back, discovering. So I had a marvelous moment when I arrived. I went to the church. I think it's called the Assembly Hall. Is it the old church, the Victorian church, which is beside the temple? very fine building, and I went in there just really out of interest, and two very nice sisters approached me, and we started to talk, and they said, "Why are you here?" So I explained, and I was flabbergasted because both of them, they're both young, very bright, obviously, are preparing to go and study environmental sciences. And why? Because of their faith. And why? I said to them, well, you know, is there a text that inspires you? And it's Alma chapter 30, verse 44. And they were so excited to be able to share that with me. Many of your young people are a long way ahead of the establishment, and that's the same in most faiths. But I think that digging down, I mean, I think one of the really exciting things, and Bob, you know, knows this stuff inside out, but others amongst you will know it, is rediscovering that this has always been important to us, and we forgot.
Other comments, questions?
Well, there's one thing that comes to mind in terms of interfaith. I've always been very inspired by Cyrus the Great.
Yeah.
I call thee by name, even though you do not know me.
Yeah.
Our God, you know, of the great. Now later on, there is unearthed an urn much later, where there is exactly the same wording in the 1890s. Cyrus, I call thee by name, even though you do not know me. I am God, Marduk, which was the name of the Babylonians. Cyrus, Babylonian, he was probably Zoroastrian. He did not just free the Jews, he freed everyone who was in slavery. And then, because the Jews had been in exile, he rebuilt their temple. And using his own coffers, taught them how to practice their religion again. And he did not do that for the Jews, he did it for all of the enslaved within Babylon. And the rebuilding of others' temples, how he created the greatest society of Western civilization. And so I think it is through the rebuilding of temples and reteaching others how to practice their faith elsewhere that this interfaith connection becomes whole and not competitive. So I really very much value this idea of an interfaith exchange of celebrating and rebuilding and teaching others how to practice their faith and use their temples wisely.
Sorry, I didn't catch your name. Your name is?
I'm Andy Pitcher.
And Andy?
Andy, my father wanted a boy.
I did wonder. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, but I think there's something which is also quite extraordinary for those of us in the prophetic faiths, the Abrahamic faiths, which is that there has been no prophet that has arisen within the faiths about the environmental struggle. The prophetic voice that we have heard has come from the secular world. It's come from scientists, it's come from economists, it's come from politicians. It came with the publication, the first major publication in 1972 called Limits to Growth. Wasn't a single religious person involved with that, not a single person. And in a sense, we've had to be awakened to our role by prophets who were without honor. And we have to acknowledge that, frankly, without them, we'd still be sleeping. So I love your image of Cyrus the Great. I think in this case, the Cyrus the Great has been the environmental movements. Now they have, because they come from a scientific or quasi-scientific background, most environmental groups are quasi-mythological. You don't adopt the panda as your major symbol because you think it's the most powerful symbol of ecology, because the panda is eating itself into extinction because it's shrunk its diet to just bamboo. So it's not a great symbol. It was only chosen because it was black and white and you could do leaflets cheaply without having to use color. And that's why they adopted the panda as their logo. But I think we need to be open to the fact that the scientific environmental world can tell us how it's going wrong. They have no idea why it might be healed. Their response is simply to do more research. We as the faiths, awoken by the new prophets, who did not come from within our traditions on the whole, We are grateful. We should be grateful to them, and we should be partnering with them. So I love your Cyrus the Great image. Love that image. Oh, someone's got their hand up. Papa Joe's phone. Papa Joe, do you want to speak?
Sure, can you hear me?
Yeah, loud and clear, mate. Loud and clear.
Okay, I'm Joe Benyon, and I'm just reminded that a couple of months ago, at the time of the summer solstice, Arvel Looking Horse, who's a spiritual leader of the Lakota people, he's the man who carries the white buffalo calf pipe and bundle for the people, and I think he's like the 14th successive carrier of that bundle, called for a day of world prayer for Grandmother Earth, as he called her. And as we speak, those people are all in the Sundance ceremony at different places around North America, dancing around a tree, a symbol of life, crying for Grandmother Earth. And I was just thinking that maybe you and Bob might want to tap into that movement, or at least somehow bring it in, because the Sundance is a time of fasting, and these are prayers specifically for Grandmother Earth that Arvel has called people worldwide to participate in.
Thank you. I think the recovery of the significance of Indigenous traditions is perhaps one of the most important things that has taken place. I think also we're beginning to break away from the mythology of the noble savage, which has turned them into plaster cast saints. And instead, we're beginning to engage with these communities as living traditions with many flaws, like every human society, but with a groundedness that we have lost. So we do a lot of work with Indigenous peoples around the world. But it is also interesting that almost all Indigenous peoples also belong to a major religion. They belong to either, if it's India, they belong to Hinduism. If it's China or Japan, they belong to Shintoism or Taoism or Buddhism. Obviously, in other areas, it's Christian, Muslim, and so forth. And you yourselves, I know, within the church, have many people who are from Indigenous communities, but for whom Church of Latter-day Saints is so important. And I think one of the things that they teach us is the importance of diversity, that they have been the bearers of an attempt to make them conform to our world. And we've got to get beyond that. But I also noticed there was a question in the text from Shelley asking about, well, what about people who are not religious? Do we still have a place for them in this? Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think, in a sense, the way I see it is that the faiths have managed to carry from generation to generation stories of wisdom and inspiration. And these are stories which do not belong to those faiths. They are stories to inspire all of us in whatever way works. So in the environmental movement, in the religious or the faith environmental movement, we also have humanist groups that work with us. We have groups that are very much based on philosophies such as it's gone. The great educational teacher, Montessori groups, for example. So no, there is nothing exclusively religious about fasting. It's just that the faiths have kept alive the idea of fasting as something important longer than any other community in the world. And so we're giving back a gift that we've kind of sort of held on to as though it was preciously ours. And the wonderful thing about Bob's approach is that he says, this is for everybody. Whoever you are, whatever you are, join us and you'll find it's different. So yeah, to answer Shelley's question, this has its origins in faith. It's been kept alive in the tradition of faith. It's being given back to the wider world as something that we may all need. I don't know if that helps, Shelley. Oh, and Hayley, you've got your hand up.
Hi, yes, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Great. So I've just been thinking here about conservation and the need to keep carbon sequestered in the environment, right? Which would just entail protecting those forests and those places that are wild. And then from there, you know, the restoration of degraded landscapes and whatnot. And just a practical questioner that I'd like to pose to you is there much investment in those areas, right? Because we're not looking to develop or create, we're looking to preserve. So how does one motivate people to put their money into something that's not going to make money?
Well, that's a very, I mean, that is a really good question, Haley, and it is a big issue because the investments of the faiths are there in order to keep their charity work going, their temples, their mosques, their churches open, to keep the care for the elderly, to look after children, to provide refuge for the refugees, you know, all the things that are in Matthew 25, basically the sheep and the goats. So what we're not talking about is converting all the investments of, say, the church into charity, because then within about 30 years, there would be nothing to keep the thing going. What we're talking about is making sure that that money is invested in things that do bring a return, but not at the cost of the earth. So when you talk about restoring landscapes, we're involved with a great project right across North Africa, which is to hold back the advance of the desert. And this is done through tree planting. Now, at one level, you would say, well, that's great, but you know, where does the profit margin come from tree planting? Well, it comes from the fact that you then restore agricultural land and you restore rainfall. And when you restore rainfall, you begin to be able to produce crops. And when you can produce crops, you can have communities return because there are jobs. But also with those trees, depending on what you plant, and one of the problems is people tend to sort of think, oh, great, eucalyptus, you know, within 5 years, you can chop it down and carve something. So we have to look at what's called just transition. And in fact, what we're in the process of creating with the World Bank is a multi-faith just transition fund. What that means is, let's take a very simple example, Haley. If a farm, a big farm, has been working with chemical fertilizers, it takes anywhere between 5 to 8 years of letting the land lie fallow before the chemicals are bleached out and you can begin to restore the soil through organic composting. Now, for that period, the profitability of that farming venture drops dramatically, probably down by 60 or 70%. So they need support through that period. But then if you introduce sustainable agricultural processes, of which there are some amazing things, and you begin to perhaps link together a whole number of farms, as we've done in the Punjab, for example, with the Sikhs, that have gone organic and branded as Sikh organic food, or in China. In China, the Taoists are producing organic Chinese traditional medicine, which is entirely herbal. It never did involve animals. Then you begin to turn a profit because people will spend more on a product that they feel is supporting the planet. But you will often have in those investment programs a lull, a period in which the profitability drops because you're restoring the land. But once it's been restored, obviously with forests, it's a longer term, but if you do agroforestry, so you mix planting of crops in amongst the trees, or you put solar panels in amongst the trees or amongst the crops, there are ways of turning a profit eventually, because we do need those profits to come in. But we have, one of the great things about the Faith as investors is we invest on average for 25 years. That's an average religious investment period. Most investors, 3 to 5. So we already bring a very different scale of potential. And it doesn't work for everything. Some things you just have to recognize that we have to be charged to repair the damage we've done. But there is more potential for a sustainable livelihood for people off the land when you restore it than one might expect. And it's really quite exciting, some of the stuff that's going on. So I don't know if that helps, Amy.
Oh, yes, it very much did. And then the other part of the question was about just the preservation of those natural untouched spaces that are continually being, at risk of being exploited.
I mean, that's the most difficult one, because one of the assumptions of the environmental movement for many years was that if you could put an economic price on wilderness, such as the Amazon or the Arctic, then you could show it was more profitable to keep it because, for example, the Amazon is absorbing CO2. The real problem is, if anybody discovers oil in the middle of the Amazon, all that economic balance is completely distorted. So I think one of the things that the faiths have been best at is where we have protected the lands we have by saying, this is not here for us. This is here for us to protect for the rest of nature. So within Islam, within the teachings of the Prophet, the Hadith, as they're called, there's a wonderful teaching where he says, the greatest act of zakat, of charity, is when someone plants a tree. Because that tree not only gives shade to the person, the family who planted it, doesn't just give firewood when it's needed or fruit when it's needed. It gives a habitat for birds to build their nests. It gives a space for insects to live, for bees to gather, for other creatures to live in the roots. So that vision of our role of protecting not for us, but for the whole of rest of life, and using our lands. In England, we have something like 12,000 churchyards, which were carved out of meadowland or forest or woodland and so forth. And these, we've now got 6,500 of those that are run as mini ecosystems. In other words, you don't cut the grass every Saturday so it looks like a suburban lawn. You cut it twice a year so the flowers grow and the birds can feed and the butterflies can move around. And I know that the church has a lot of land, and you have nice grounds around you, though they're often fairly formal, and you have car parks because people come. But why not break up those car parks with more gardens, with spaces where the rainwater can soak into the earth, where you plant trees not just so that you can trim them and they all look neat, but have some wild areas where, you might have had a most wonderful experience in the church or the temple, but you just go and sit there and you listen to the birds and it takes you somewhere else. So we need to think creatively about the land that we as faiths have, because we don't make a profit out of a lot of our land. It's just there. So you're quite right. There is a real religious duty to use our land creatively. Thanks, Haley.
Thank you.
Oh, it's gone like a Quaker meeting. That's always slightly worrying. Bob, you must have something to say here.
My name is Jenny Rees. I'm Bob's daughter. And
Oh, hi, Jenny. How nice to meet you.
I heard about this a few weeks ago. Dad was really excited that you were coming to visit. I live in Los Angeles, and we have what are considered food deserts, where there are a lot of people who live in poverty who don't have easy access to fresh produce, let alone organic produce. And so what do we do in terms of equity for people who can't afford paying more for their food? And, we've done a few things in California, like people can use their food stamps, what used to be called food stamps, but it's basically food provided by the government, paid for by the government, to, if they are shopping at a farmer's market, they can get twice as much produce for their buck as they would at a grocery store or someplace else. But there's still really a lot of, I think, food inequity, as well as hunger that occurs even in a place like Los Angeles. So I guess I'd be interested in your take on that in terms of, well, I could pay more for produce that is organic or produced in a more sustainable way. What about the other folks?
I think one of the biggest areas that I've seen the faiths tackle the consequences of bad capitalism, which is what you're talking about.
Yes.
You're talking about the people who have they've never been left behind, they've never been invited in. That's the major problem. We have now created a kind of consumerist capitalism that has reduced the number of jobs, except incredibly demeaning jobs, frankly. We've taken away from people any kind of access to resources that they can manage for themselves. And we've been working a lot, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, where, to be honest, Jenny, the problems you're facing in California are, first world problems in comparison with what's going on, say, in Uganda or in Chad. Not that I'm demeaning what happens there, but we're dealing with entire communities literally expiring, dying of hunger and loss of land and so forth. And one of the ways forward has been through the microfinance program, because the major thing is when you have no access to finance what you want to do, you are powerless. You are completely powerless. You're at the whim of whoever has that money. So I'll give you one simple example. This is from Tanzania, and there the Lutheran Church has set up multi-faith banks for Muslim, Christian, Hindu, indigenous peoples in areas like Kilimanjaro, where because the snow is no longer falling, the water is no longer flowing in the quantities it was, much of the farmland is now devastated, it's desert, it's drying out, crops have failed, cattle have died. So the Lutheran Church in Tanzania, headed by the wonderful Bishop Shu, has created farmers' banks. It has also created handicraft investment banks, because if you can give people something they can do, something that they can sell, something that gives them a status, if you can do it in a way that you don't tie them into debt, but you give them a sense of responsibility, it is remarkable what can happen. It really is. I've watched areas that were going into the desert 15 years ago are now fruitful and growing. It's extraordinarily encouraging. However, in our developed world, that's where we're developing this notion of a just transition fund. For example, when you say, right, no more coal, no more oil, no more gas, very often what the environmental movement does is it sort of demonizes the communities that used to produce this. And those communities are now falling into poverty because they're no longer allowed to dig up the coal or to export the gas. I'm in Alberta, and in Alberta, the clampdown, this is the second largest oil field in the world outside Saudi Arabia, but it's not going to be developed. It's not going to be used, not unless we all fall into the trap of thinking that because we can't get cheap energy at the moment, we should do whatever we can to get it. But what I see here, and I was shocked to see the number of people living on the streets, and I said, why is this? And they said, well, because there's no economy here. Our economy was oil and gas, and that's gone. It's had to go, we recognize that, but there's been no just transition. So there's been no new kind of jobs, of creative jobs, of products that have been offered for the communities here to take up. So that's why when we talk about the Multi-Faith Just Transition Fund, we're talking not just about stopping what's bad, but it's about giving the people who used to produce it, who didn't think they were doing anything bad, giving them the sense that actually there is a future. But it's very tough. We are in an economic model that despises those who are not greedy. And that's very dangerous, I think, Jenny, very dangerous indeed. But Christ said, the poor will always be with you, but that does not mean that we must enjoy or force or enable the poor. The only way that people will get respect, Islam has the tradition of zakat. You give 2.5% of your disposable income every year. What is that for? It's not for charity. It's to invest into communities and families and individuals who perhaps through sickness or through disaster or through failed marriages or relationships have no longer got the wherewithal to reconstruct their lives. Zakat is a fund for reconstructing damaged or destroyed livelihoods and lives. We need to go back to that, I think. But I see Therese has got her hand up as well.
Yes,
Guys.
sorry, I'm Teresa Gomez. I am not showing my face because I'm just recovering from COVID and, you know, looking great. I just wanted to say I'm very excited about this initiative. I think it's brilliant the way we're trying to celebrate our differences and just like have a way to be united and see each other as brothers or sisters or like I don't know, inhabitants of this earth. I work with LDS Stewardship. I'm part of the board, and this is just really exciting for us. And I think the part I'm the most excited about is the international reach. I am originally from Mexico City, where we see a lot of the consequences of climate change and things like this, right? I see it in my own family. Like growing up in Mexico City has given some health issues to my own mother, right? Like, so I see how this is real. So I think my comment and question here is, what are we going to do to have an international reach, right? Like really reach those communities that might not be able, right? We have really smart people that get to know about these ideas and stories. I think our biggest challenge will be to reach all those communities and make them be part of this, because I think there's a really big, there's so many great things that are coming out of this fasting. I think people will feel a change in their health, a change in their faith, and changing the way they interact with other fellow citizens of the planet. I think it will be very nice to see. I think this will make us kind of like change our perspective and see how God is answering our fast and see the hand of God in our lives. I think there's so many wonderful things that can come out of this. So I think the greatest challenge and the thing that we really need to be thinking about is how we're going to make it so we can really reach those who are suffering and seeing the bad consequences of this the most, right?
Yeah. I think that's where the faiths have a unique role, Teresa, because there is no community in the world, except possibly in North Korea, where there is not a religious structure somewhere in that community. Now, some of those religious structures have kind of hidden themselves away. They've built walls to keep out the people they don't like and don't agree with. But on the whole, and I've traveled the world, I've met every major religion and worked with them on the ground, I would say that they are the tiny minority. Most of the faiths are central to keeping civil society going. Very interesting piece of research in the US was that the United Methodist Church of the US, which is I think it's the third largest, or no, fourth or fifth largest religious community in the States, about 9 million. Their voluntary work in terms of food banks, in terms of welfare, in terms of kindergartens and looking after the elderly and providing places for people who are desperate, in a very interesting exercise undertaken by, I'm trying to remember it, well, actually undertaken by Georgetown University, estimated that at least $20 million worth of voluntary contribution to the support of their local communities came purely from the Methodists, who are not vast, they're not big. So we underestimate the fact that we already have this network there, Teresa. The network is there, the faiths are there. It's just they're sleeping on the job. But I've watched over the years as they've woken up both to the economic challenges, to the challenges of racism, the whole gender issues, to the whole range of things that we thought we had carefully parceled up and stuck in a corner. And the way that I see most faiths struggling with this is to say, okay, we're not quite sure where we're going, but we know we're being asked to go somewhere bigger than we've been before. And one thing that we were able to launch 2 weeks ago is that the Rockefeller Foundation and the Brookings Institute are coming in with us to create an international network of religious media so that we can begin to feed stories into that and data and information, but we can also hear the stories back. And a new organization called 8 Billion has been created to be a forum where communities like your own could send in a video just filmed on a phone and say, this is why we care, this is what we're doing to protect our people, to protect our environment, to protect our future. And already we're having tens of thousands of these stories coming through. So the networks exist, Teresa. What they often require, and this is Bob's brilliance, is something stunningly simple. So not some great plan to reclaim the desert of the Gobi or something like that. That can come from other sources. But it's, you know, in the Tao Te Ching, it says famously, the journey of 1,000 miles starts with your decision to put one foot in front of the other. Bob's suggestion is that one step in front of to get the journey going. And it may sound small, you know, if Bob and I give up our meals, so what? But our goal is at least 1 billion people doing that. And then that isn't just one step. That's the 1,000 paces we need, because it carries with it the seeds of thinking differently. And that's the secret of what Bob has put his finger on.
Thank you.
Mark, we have a comment or two from the live audience. Can we take those?
Yeah, please, absolutely. As long as people say their name.
Hi, this is Hamish speaking.
Sorry, I'm so sorry, I missed that.
Hamish.
Oh, Hamish, I'm so sorry, but Scottish ancestry, I should have caught that name.
I'm curious, on the tails of that comment about the simplicity of Bob's idea, I think that's evidenced in people saying, how do I get involved? I'm curious, what's the, how do we design the experience for people to get involved? I mean, at what level has this idea progressed into a technological solution? What ideas are on the table in terms of how this is actually going to come forth? That sounds like something I'd be interested in.
Okay, I mean, as a similar question just got asked about by Shelley about what's the best next step. I think what I would say is that there is already a massive movement around the world by the faith to make deeper, longer commitments, which we will be announcing also at Egypt at the climate conference. And there are, well, it's very hard to guesstimate, but I would say we've got about, I think we're about halfway towards Bob's target of 1 billion people doing kind of things like this. We've certainly got to that figure in terms of the different faith communities. I mean, a simple example would be we've got 9,000 Catholic organizations from entire universities, religious orders, schools, you know, around the world who've said, right, we're going to change. We're going to do this with our investments. We're going to do this. We're going to go back to the Friday fast, for example. That's coming back in again, having been abandoned in the 70s, early 70s. So it's already out there. I think the next step, to be honest, for Latter-day Saints is to think systematically, okay, use this faith plans tool. What is it that we aren't doing, we could do with what we've already got? Because often it's working with what you've already got. It's not getting some huge fund to manage it. You know, you run institutions, you do development work, you have educational programs, you have young people programs. Fantastic. How focused are they on helping them, those people protect the planet, protect themselves from the consequences of not protecting the planet? So you've got it there, but I think very often what has to happen is for a faith to take a long look at how they use what they've got and say, could we do more? And that's in the faith plans. And you will be joining literally hundreds of thousands of religious communities around the world that are doing that. And we would be delighted if the two environmental organizations in the Mormon Church were to come on board, or other groups were to come into it. So there is something you can join, which gives you a program, it gives you allies in every part of the world to work with. But in the end, if the individual has not made some kind of personal change, then this is all fine and it all looks great on paper. But in the end, there's got to be that personal motivation. And that's where Bob's proposal of the fast day, building on your existing tradition, is so brilliant. But it's only a first step. It's only a first step, but it's a damn powerful one.
Martin, for Soren here would like to say something.
Hi, Soren. Nice to hear from you again.
Good to see you. So for those of you who weren't there Saturday, we had a wonderful opportunity to meet Bob and Martin in person at Randall and Jan Paul's home down in Holiday. I took to heart that discussion, and over the weekend, although it wasn't our typical fast Sunday, I made the third Sunday of July and perpetually going forward my fast forward Sunday. And often the case with our fast days, they're accompanied by a testimony. And I want to share with you some insights or inspiration that I had over the weekend while doing this. First of all, my mother is very, very conservative. And I often have trouble speaking to her about things like climate change and stuff like that. But I had a wonderful idea while we're watching. She spent several years ago a mission in England, in the Birmingham area. And as we've been watching this heat wave this weekend, I thought, let's talk a little bit about the heat wave in Great Britain and what that means to set an all-time ever recorded in human history high, and what we can do. And so I had a conversation with her over the weekend about what can we do to curb our carbon emissions. And I thought my mom would say her typical thing, which is, oh, climate change is a hoax, it's not happening, God's in charge, we can't possibly plan it. But instead she came back with a thought that I've been recycling my whole life, and that was a big part of my inspiration for the environmental movement, was my mom recycling. And she shared some things, and I said, write that down in your journal and make sure you pass that on. So it was a wonderful opening to a conversation that I hadn't had really in a meaningful way before. The second insight was had to do with the word replenish. And we have a really when you read in Genesis 1:28 that God, when he created man, said multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it and have dominion. Replenish in many of the English texts of the Old Testament is fill, or expand or multiply. But when you read the other texts and the other creation, including the one Mark referenced, which is in the temple, in the King James Version of the Latter-day Saint Scriptures, the footnote to replenish is fill. But in the inspired translations, the Book of Moses, the Book of Abraham, and in the temple ceremony, where Joseph Smith could have used replenish. Between fill and replenish. They are to nourish, they are to refill, they are to renew. And that was a really powerful kind of insight to think about what replenish means in this context that we're talking about.
Can I say something in response to what you just said? One of the things that Martin and I feel is that the stories that people will tell throughout the world, we have this annual celebration will be, in a sense, a kind of world testimony meeting in which people are talking about the very thing that you just said. You shared this idea, you started fasting already, which makes me feel like I will do that as well, and we will. And you share that idea and you hear somebody's story, tell it, and that story inspires somebody else to do something. And that's where the multiplying factor happens. is that this thing begins to grow because a story, they say an enemy is somebody whose story you don't know. And as we tell these stories about what has happened to us when we fasted, when we came together, when we thought about people someplace else, and that I'm very inspired by the Jewish idea of tikkun olam, which means that everyone is charged with repairing the world. That everybody has this. Every Jew feels I have some responsibility to that. And the response to that, you may not succeed, but neither are you excused from trying. And so as we come together and tell these stories, and as we manufacture these stories from our own experience, we believe it will inspire people. One other thing that I think is important in response to what somebody said, our idea is that this fund that will grow will be used on every continent, and it will be used for every faith. And every faith and every continent, all people will be blessed in some way. We haven't yet figured that out, but this is a resource for humanity and for the creatures of the world. So,
Thank you.
Jay, may I just follow up with one last insight?
Yes.
Like my insights often come in threes, and the third one. So many of you know I work for an agency called the Jordan River Commission. Our Jordan River here is named for the Jordan River in the Holy Land because the geologic references are similar. It connects a freshwater lake and a saline lake. This made Elisha and Elijah and the transfer of that mantle in the Old Testament. And I was struck, and it actually came up in our discussion, that Elijah parted the Jordan River and crossed over and was taken away in the whirlwind. And Elisha crossed back and parted the Jordan River and came back. The thing that really struck me was when they talked about walking across the Jordan River, the bed, on dry land. There's been a lot of conversation about what's going on with the Great Salt Lake over the last year and a half, as we're seeing record-setting low levels of our saline lake and all of the risks, environmental risks and economic risks and other things that come with that. There are places on the Jordan River where at any given time, our Jordan River, you can walk across on dry land.
wow.
I've done it many times. And if you want to understand why the Great Salt Lake looks like it does, it's because the Jordan River looks like that all the time. Down in Bluffdale and even in Saratoga Springs this last spring, you could walk across the Jordan River on dry land because there was no river. So that to me was a really powerful testimony in thinking about the work that we were studying in Come Follow Me, that we have important work to do here. Thinking globally, acting locally, we're seeing the impacts of our climate, our drought, all of these things, and you see it in the landscape. And we're all invested locally. And for me, it was kind of a call to action that I need to take this component of the water and the relationship. I love that term Martin used, the relationship with the earth. Our stewardship is really about a relationship. And our relationship right here is poor because we're not connected to what we're doing. That's harming and damaging.
That's beautiful. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to go in a minute or two because my godfather has cooked dinner, which at 97 is quite an achievement. Jay, thank you for the invitation to join you. And Bob, is again a joy and a delight. I just wish I was with you, I have to say. But Jay, you probably want to wrap up, or are you going to carry on while I go and have dinner? Oh, that sounds a little bit selfish, doesn't it?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. So we're gonna close a little bit. Love to have you. We're gonna have. Sorry. Yeah. So
all right.
we're gonna
take care, all of you, and thank you so much. Fascinating evening as always with you lot. Really is. God bless.
Thank you so much, Martin.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you.
So as long as it's quick, because we are good hosts. I told them at 9. So
one, I think, especially in developing countries, you've got to get the governments involved. Many of them have a spiritual kind of a foundation. And the other way that that's going to have an impact is that the benefit, people in the developing countries are getting raped by US Western-based companies. Whether you go to Tanzania, Ghana, anywhere else. And so I think unless you get some governments involved and then get some of the businesses involved in those things, the people there are going to continue to suffer. But I think there are motivations for leaders in the countries based on religious and spiritual values.
I'd be happy to get our Congress members to be fasting.
Yeah. Well, Romel's done a bit of work, in those countries. I think that's, I think one of the part of their vision is that since 80% of people have some kind of tie to religion, the religion can inspire maybe the governments. I mean, for decades, people have tried to get governments to do the right thing, and it often fails. So I think they're hoping to inspire governments through this collection of religious organizations. I would love to keep going on all night, just like we did on Saturday, where we go 3+ hours or more. But
This is the beginning.
yeah, this is
There'll
the
be more
beginning.
opportunities. And your ideas will always be part of the conversation as we step forward into this thing. I was just thinking as you were saying this thing about the Jordan River, what would have happened if Jesus and John had come to be baptized and there was no water. Yeah, that's a good point.
Real quick, yes, Ed.
I love this, very inspiring. And throughout I had a thought that what might help it be effective is, I was thinking of the I voted stickers, or wearing a cross, or Ash Wednesday, or an AA token. People who get involved in this could have something visible that then sparks conversation with people. And I think it really could bridge differences between the faithful and secular people, because it's a shared common.
Thank you, Zach. We've got some people hopefully working on branding and logo and all of those things that will obviously be part of it.
That's a great thought. Okay.
Lastly, because it takes a dentist and 10 needles to shut me up. I just want to remind you, I've been thinking a lot about this, and then when he presented on, first of all, the connection between Utah Lake and the Great Salt Lake.
Ben Adam.
Who, but I have been reminded by Kylie Turley, who wrote the brilliant book on Alma, that we are different as a people. When Lehi arrives, he makes a covenant, and it's not like the Abrahamic covenant. He makes a covenant with the land. He makes a covenant to create a promised land, not the other way around. The land does not promise to Nephi, to Lehi, it does not covenant with Lehi that it will be there forever for its disobedient sons, for its genocides, for its wars. No, it is that we make a covenant. We are a covenant people, and our covenant is to make the land promised. It is within our gospel that our covenant of our first prophet is made with land. And that's an interesting point which we overlook often.
Thank you. Great insight. Thank you. So I failed to thank Amy and Brian McConkey for opening their lovely home. Thank you. Brian set things up here and got things working, and Madison Daniels with Stuart managed the official Zoom recording and everything. So thank you, Madison. And I'm just so deeply grateful to each of you who showed up here and then showed up via Zoom. I love you. I love that you're willing to take some time and come together and have busy schedules and talk about things that really matter. So I'm so appreciative that you would do that and share your ideas and your hearts and your inspirations and your initiatives of Third Sunday Fast. That's just beautiful. Your ideas are tokens of what we're doing. That's a very Jewish thing in a way, isn't it? I love that. So thank you. Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. I would, it kind of occurred to me as we were doing this tonight that I would like to, because the Temple's brought it, after singing a brief hymn that I wish Martin were here. So Bob and Gloria brought Martin to my ward here, just a block away, for his first ward experience. This ward experience, that was
And
fun.
Lucas always shocked to pick up that cup and see the water.
I'll be disappointed. But a hymn that came to mind was 92, For the Beauty of the Earth, not very long. And then I asked Kelly Stewart, sorry, Jim and Judy's daughter, if she would just kind of start us out on that. And then I would like us to gather in a circle, a prayer circle, and I've asked Gloria to offer a benediction and a blessing on us, that we might go forth and actually have our feet do the praying, do something about what we just heard. So, is that okay with everybody?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, so I'll give you a sec to get it up. So if you have the hymn app, it's 92, For the Beauty of the Earth. You could just Google that too and find the lyrics. And when you tell me when most people are ready. Gloria?
A sounding pitch, okay?
Yeah, and then
nice upbeat tempo.
And then when we get to the prayer part, while you're looking this up, so when we get to the prayer part, Gloria, why don't you just give us like 30 seconds to do a silent prayer religion?
Lovely, yes.
Of kind of prayer for meditation before you start invoking. If that's okay, or Heavenly Parents, thank you.
Yeah.
Does everybody have the song? No, we ready? Okay, Kelly?
Here's our pitch, is everybody got it? Okay, 1, 2, let's sing for the beauty of the earth, for the beauty of the sky, for the marvelous from our birth, over and countless flags. Lord of all, to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise. For the beauty of each hour of the day and of the night, hill and vale and tree and flower, sun and moon and stars of light. Lord of all, to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise. For the joy of human love, brother, sister, mother, and child, friends on earth and friends above, for all gentle thoughts and mild. Lord of all, to thee we raise this our hymn of grateful praise.
Oh, that's lovely, thank you. Let's gather in a big circle.
Yes.
Circle. Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to divide you.
No.
Divide
Nice
it. Get around here, we can spread back here, or we can get around, come around in front of this table here. Come up here, you guys, get right in here. You want to sit right in here, right in front of the couch. Let's get close. Come on the couch. You got room. We don't have that many people. So you can hold hands or put your arms around each other's back, whatever.
All right,
Like, but
so
you can't touch.
let's all breathe in unison for about 5 breaths here. our gracious, dear Heavenly Mother, Father, parents, the family of this world and earth and the universe. We unite here with our hearts, with seeds planted within us that are new, that are birthing. Help us to be grounded in our grandmother earth, and that we may rise through the darkness by engaging one another and hearing our stories and walking our prayers up through the earth and being replenished by the light and love of life itself that is given to us. Help us to covenant to this earth, that we will replenish within it and among us and beyond us, that we may feel that guidance growing within us and recognize it. Remember that we may become homes for the other creatures and food and love, and help our imagination to be fed through our stillness, and that we may then know best ways where we are supported in our actions. We're grateful for one another here. We're grateful for one another as people and as creatures and as all creation, as the rock and ground and minerals and all that we are part of the stars, of the creations we know not of. Help us to feel this wondrous connection, not only now, but as we walk forward. We pray thy blessings upon this action, and that we may celebrate daily for even being able to conceive of it. We pray that we may know how to fast with our hearts and minds as well as with our bodies, with our souls, and love thee. And we say these things in the name of our beloved brother, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Gorgeous.
Thank you all for being here.
Yes.
Writing. Thank you.
Have a second later.